Well, the Doug Ford government here in Ontario tabled a $214 billion spending plan with a $9.8 billion deficit. Ontario's finance minister says it's important to invest in the province's economy.
Global economies have slowed, the cost of everything is higher, and so we've had two choices. Put the brakes on or keep going. Mr. Speaker, we choose to keep going to rebuild Ontario's economy because it is the right thing to do.
Okay, it's a big deficit, it's a big budget. How are the politics around this going to play out? It's time to bring in the power panel. Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal campaign director. Françoise Boivin is a former NDP MP. And here with me in the studio in Ottawa, Kate Harrison is a Conservative political analyst, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. Okay, Kate, a big shift in Ontario's financial position. They were looking at a $200 million surplus this year, now a $9.8 billion deficit. This follows an $11 billion deficit in Quebec, an $8 billion deficit in British Columbia. A lot of red ink piling up at the provincial level.
Yeah, you see a lot of provinces, Ontario included, really grappling with growth. And, you know, typically the expression is, if you build it, they will come. I think what Ontario is now doing is saying, well, we have to build it because they're already here. So you've got record investments in healthcare, education, post-secondary, considering kind of government spend in previous areas. And it is because we simply have more people and not enough baseline infrastructure support to support that growth. So there either has to be a difficult conversation at the federal level about how many people are coming into the province, or there needs to be a serious conversation about paying to support that growth. Now, I think the feds have downloaded a lot of that to the provinces and the municipalities to bear out. And so that's why you see this is a bit of a wedge that Ford is creating in terms of, hey, help us out by at least, and help Ontarians out by at least giving us a break on the carbon tax, for example. So it's a big challenge for Ontario to deal with. There is that path to balance still there for 2026, which is more than I could say for the federal Liberal government.
Yeah, but that's going to be tough, Michelle, for them to commit to a path to balance a couple of years out from now, running up to an election, and who knows where the economy is going to go. But that's what they're counting on. But as we see, it can change pretty quickly. I mean, what's your sense on this, going from $3 billion last year to $10 billion this year? Some of it is Bill 124, some of it is new spending, some of it is deferred revenue from the gas tax holiday. What's your take on the budget?
Yeah, and I think there's the reality of coming out of COVID and all of the enormous spending that was done then, and combined with the sluggish economy. You just said it. That's really hurting finances. I'm a little bit skeptical if they're going to meet those targets. I think they threw in that line so that some of their conservative friends who are wondering where fiscal responsibility is could, there's a page to point to. I'd also say, healthcare. They're not actually increasing healthcare spending. They are not actually keeping up with inflation. And let's be honest, it wasn't choices they made to put money into healthcare. It was a legal order that they had to follow to put money into healthcare. So, anyone who's in Ontario thinking that there might be some hope to find a family doctor because the Ford government's doing something, well, no need to read the document. There's nothing there. You're going to keep waiting for another 2 years. They threw in some good political things in terms of obviously, keeping the carbon tax front and center. So by reinforcing that they're going to extend the gas tax rebate. If anybody thinks that they're going to actually, reimpose the additional gas tax, when they're just before an election next January, I just don't believe it. And, a few little things here and there, and let's see what they do on auto insurance. It could be something that is very consumer friendly, so I'll applaud them on that. But it's not something to hang your hat on. There's not much in this whole thing. And I think that they want this to be a one-day story, and hopefully everybody can focus on their premier cousins who have got up to semantics in Ottawa.
But Françoise, it's a string of big deficits from the three biggest provinces. Alberta, being number 4, had a surplus that you kind of got to squint at and hope oil stays high in production and high in dollar amounts. There's some things here. I have not yet parsed the budget enough to know how much of the new spending on health and education is Bill 124 catch-up and how much of it is actual increases in the base. They've done things like there's money to create a medical school at York University, but that's going to take years to sort sort of deal with doctor training. But what do you make of this, the shift in the financial situation? Because the Quebec deficit, too, also historically high, and this is the largest non-COVID deficit we've seen since Kathleen Wynne in 2014, I believe.
Definitely. And at first I was saying to myself, my goodness, it could be the title in Ontario could be we're way less deficit than in Quebec, because all we talk about in Quebec is the 11 billion. If there's one number people remember, it's the 11 billion deficit. But that being said, the government of Quebec is investing way more. And when I talk investment, I think Michelle is bang on. The hike in the budget for health is I think 1.something%. It's basically nothing. As in Quebec, they reinvest en masse. So that can explain the big deficit. Plus in Quebec, they have what they call un fonds de la génération, generation fund. So of the 11 billion, there's about 2.some billion that goes there for future reference. So it's not exactly an 11 billion deficit. So I was listening. I didn't study the budget completely, but it lacked, how could I say, it lacked some type of vision. It seemed like just a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit everywhere, things to come, like the auto insurance. We don't exactly know the details. So for me, it's a budget, but with big numbers, and hopefully the economic situation is going to improve in the next couple of years before they go into an election. Right. But imagine if it would worsen for some type of reason. We live in such dangerous time and weird times. We can't bet that it will definitely go on the upside, on the positive side. So I think these governments are a bit left aside. And I'll end by saying I'm always amazed to see it's the federal that will almost come up with their budget last. It used to be federal, then the provincial. We're in weird times, let me tell you.
Look, we get the main estimates before the budget. It is weird. I mean, that, it's a nerdy accounting thing, but it is what it is. Charlotte, I can't believe Françoise didn't go through all $216 billion in the hour and 42 minutes this budget has been made public. But look, you are seeing a deterioration in the balance sheets at the provincial level. And I know they're, like, with the letter writing campaign for the Premier's trying to put pressure on the federal government to assign blame there. They're also making some choices on foregone revenue and legal settlements they have to make. It's interesting to see them doing things on affordability when the Bank of Canada and a lot of banks are saying, provinces, you need to slow down too, because you're juicing some of the inflationary picture. What's your sense of what we've seen from Ontario today?
Well, I did find it interesting that, especially for a conservative government, and you keep hearing the railing against deficit spending and how much of a problem it is when the federal government does it, that everybody is now saying, oh, well, you know what, maybe it's not so bad or times are tough. Granted, this current federal government, the Liberal government, they were doing the whole deficit spending thing, pre-COVID. So it's not apples to apples. However, if it's good for the goose, good for the gander type of thing, right? The Ontario Finance Minister did highlight and did call out the fact that there are, global forces that are affecting the Ontario financial situation, which I thought was really interesting, because it wasn't just, oh, this is a problem because the federal government has made it our problem. There was, Kay mentioned, downloading by the federal government. I don't know, I suppose there is some of that to a degree, but it also kind of exposes some areas where the province just hasn't been pulling its fair share or doing its fair share. If you look at something like, post-secondary education, and they are now basically scrambling to fill the gap that they were of revenue that they were making off the backs of foreign students. And now all of a sudden, now that that's gone, they're going, oh, well, we can't possibly, do this without the revenue we were getting from foreign students essentially being taken advantage of. Like the fact that you have to essentially admit that by saying we don't have the money for this without that, that. I think that's a really interesting and, kind of galling problem that they have. And, and then there's other things like childcare. There is money in there for, new school projects, which do come with licensed childcare spaces, but there wasn't any real push or detail given to the idea of how are we dealing with the issue of the subsidized childcare program that so many people have said they're having trouble in fulfilling.
It's interesting, the different views on deficit spending, because like one government's inflation-juicing deficit is another government's growth-unleashing investment, right? Depending on how you want to spin it. But look, one thing all these governments have to consider, including the federal government, because we're 2 weeks away from the federal budget, and the Bank of Canada today raised some alarms on Canada's lagging productivity. Have a listen to what Senior Deputy Bank Governor Carolyn Rogers said today.
An economy with low productivity can only grow so fast before inflation starts to set in. That's why I want to talk about Canada's long-standing poor record on productivity and convince you just how big of a problem it is. You know those signs that say, in an emergency, break the glass? Well, it's time to break the glass.
Okay, Kate, that's a pretty dire warning there from the Bank of Canada about lagging productivity, and an emergency is why these projections in Ontario, could they hold? I don't know. What we take from that and what we saw in Ontario and what we might see here in Ottawa in 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think pretty unprecedented comments in terms of the gravity of that. And there's a few things that are fueling that, according to the Bank of Canada. A regulatory environment that is not great for competition, for example. Yes, sluggish productivity, a lack of investment coming into the country, probably due in part to that regulatory complexity or uncertainty as they describe it. And of course, we have to consider how tax plays a role in that. And I think that that's where actually Conservatives have a strong pivot point when it comes to things like the carbon tax. Okay, what are we doing to create an environment that attracts investment and competition rather than one that taxes them to high heaven? There were some things in the Ontario budget, I think, that are designed to address that productivity challenge. More funding in post-secondary education, more funding for skills training is up there. It's worth noting that revenues are up. Yes, spending is up, but revenues are up as well in the province of Ontario. That's not the case in every province. So it's a huge challenge for sure. But I think the right question that governments need to be asking is what regulations do we need to look at and assess? What is our tax base or our tax model to make sure that we're getting as much money and competition and growth coming into the province and country as possible?
Yeah, I think, Michelle, some of the math on this $9.8 billion deficit in Ontario, $1 billion of that is a reserve. I don't know why you have a reserve with the deficit that large, but they do have $1 billion of that. And another $2 to $3 billion would be the Bill 124 catch-up. So some of it is a result of the legal thing. But what do you make of this warning from the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada today, sort of on Ontario Budget Day, the second biggest budget with the biggest budget still to come, about the productivity challenges and the slow growth challenges the country is facing?
I think it's hugely concerning, the decline from what they're now saying over the last 40 years, but is astronomical, where we went from 90% of the U.S. Productivity numbers to something like 71%. That we can't sustain that. And one of the things that's keeping us going, if I read this right, is the new Canadians coming into the country. The other thing I read in there was just our lack of being able to match the skills of the new Canadians to actually more productive jobs and utilizing those skills. And so, this is something that we've all got to, and when I say all, every party and every government, no matter the stripe, has to take it seriously. I got to say, the warning was an echo back to me of the early 90s of the debt warnings that were starting to come at the government about, you're getting in trouble, bondholders, and starting to hear those kinds of beyond the political debate, beyond the partisan debate, but actual real warnings from economists. And so I would hope that every government takes this incredibly seriously. We have to make the right investments. We have to make Canada the place where others will make investments, where we can draw in a capital and utilize the people that are coming in. I'm not saying it's easy, but there has to be a concerted effort on this. And, now's the time to kind of put together that team that's going to tackle it and figure out how we actually turn those numbers around. So,
Francoise, quickly though, when you look at this warning from the Bank of Canada on how we are productivity-wise in terms of what the economy could look like going forward, $11 billion deficit in Quebec, $10 billion in round numbers in Ontario, $8 billion in British Columbia, The deficit coming from the federal government, $40 billion is the target as restraint, you know, to keep it there. You add it all together, and it's some troubling arithmetic for the country.
Yes, but at the same time, it's not that surprising. I mean, I was listening to the Bank of Canada, the same Bank of Canada who a couple of years ago were saying interest rate would never go up. Everything was rosy, and that was just at the start of the pandemic. I don't think Canada is different than other part of the world. It's as if the world went on kind of a stop mode for a bit, and we're having a hard time restarting, and we're left with all the things that had to be done during the pandemic. That's the problems often in politics. We tend to forget the past, and that's why we redo the same mistakes over and over again. So I'm not that worried, but I do hope that our governments are well aware of it, are trying to find imaginative ways of getting out of that slump, and not just paying the bill or hiking this or and try to be a bit more imaginative. So we'll see, because having your fourth items in your budget being the reimbursement of interest on your debt is not a fun thing.
No, and it's something the federal government did to take the costs off the provinces during the pandemic, but here we are now, everyone's struggling. So Cheryl, quick last words to you. And by the way, Francoise, forgetting your past and repeating the same mistakes, that's not just politics, that's life. Cheryl, that's everybody.
No.
Sure.
I would just say that, you know, when you think about what it is that the Bank of Canada is saying, you think it would behoove, you know, all the first ministers who are, you know, kind of trying to fight with each other or more fight with the federal government to come up with something that they can find some sort of common ground on, because businesses and everybody who's looking to all these other ideas, people are saying, we want people to come to Canada, we want people to invest. You can't do that if, you know, all the regulatory environments and the carbon pricing and environmental policies, if those are up and down and out the door, and if we don't have a stable environment for people to come and invest in, nobody's going to want to come here.